Hello, we are continuing our working on the dashboard in a day data, bringing it into Power Query and doing some transformations on it. In the last video we connected to the data, so now we're going to work in Power Query and I will show you around how the system works. So this is where we got to before. The very first thing you need to know is that you can open and close the Power Query window, because remember, it's just a window that sits on top of the main Power BI window. Some of the time when we're doing our transformations we want to have it open, but then when we've finished and we want to start working in the Power BI window, for example on the data model, we don't need it open any longer. When we've finished working in Power Query, you just click Close and Apply there, and then it will pull your data into the data model and we'll be able to see it here in model view. And if you want to do some more transformations now, to reopen the Power Query window, all you have to do is to go back to the Home tab and click the Transform Data button. Then it reopens Power Query where you were before. So let me just demonstrate some of the basic features of Power Query itself. On the left we have a list of names of the tables that we connected to, and these become queries. So it's called the query pane here because these are no longer just the static tables, they actually represent a series of steps that we're applying to those tables as well. And we can change from one to another to work with the different queries just by clicking on them like that. Remember that the query pane can be closed, so if it's closed you can only see the preview of one of your queries at a time, and if you need to change to a different one you've got to reopen the query pane, select the other query, and that's the way to change from one to another. On the right hand side we have a list of applied steps, and this is where Power Query gets a lot of its power from, because these applied steps show you the individual transformations that we are applying to the starting table, one after another, starting at the top. And if I click on one of these steps you can see that the preview changes. This is what the data would look like if we'd applied the applied steps from the top down to the selected step. So for example, if I wanted to do some new steps, let's say I want to take this product column and make it all uppercase, I could select it by clicking on its header, right click, transform, and I get a series of transformations that are appropriate to text data. I don't get different ones if it's numbers or dates. And if I wanted to make that all uppercase, I just do that. Now it's all uppercase. And what's happened over on the right is it is added another applied step below the previous three. If I decided I wanted to delete the product ID, I can select it, right click, remove. And again, that has applied a new applied step below the other ones. Now the great thing is it's really easy to undo. So if I decide I didn't want to do those two things after all, I just go to my applied steps, hover over the last one, click on the red X, and that removes that step and I've got my product ID back. If I didn't want to make my product column uppercase, hover over uppercase text there, click on the X, and now it's back to what it was before. So it's like a super undo feature really, the applied steps. One feature of Power Query that is quite useful when you start working particularly with things like changing the data type is to have the formula bar turned on, and at the moment on my screen it's turned off. So to turn the formula bar on you go to the View tab, and here is the setting for it. So put a tick in the box next to formula bar, and now we can see the M code for the selected step. So that's for changing the type, and you can see that in this single step it's actually classified the data type for all 5 columns that I have in this particular query. Int 64 is the data type for whole numbers, and you can see that the zip code at the moment is classified as a whole number, int 64, and we don't want that. We want it to be a text field to be compatible with the text symbols that appear in the zip code in the international sales data. But before we do that, I think the very first thing I want to do is to make sure that the names of the queries, which are going to appear in the Power BI window as the names of tables, are a bit more user-friendly and self-explanatory to ordinary users. We don't want it to look too techy. Sales is fine. International sales could maybe have a space in it. So if you want to change the names of these things, you can double click on the left, like that. Or if I want to change product name just to product, I can change it on the right in the properties pane. I think I'll change Geo to geography with a capital G, and I'll give manufacturer a capital M. Okay, so now let's come back to our sales query. We're going to work through the different queries from top to bottom and do the transformations that we said we would need to do. So the very first thing I need to do is to change the data types so they're all correct. Product ID, that's fine, that's a whole number. Date has been classified as a date, that's fine too. And for any people from America who are looking at this, I'm in the UK, and so I'm using international date format, day, month, year. So that's why the first number goes up above 12. Now the zip code, so this is the first one we actually have to change. I can see that at the moment it's using a whole number for the zip code. I need to click on the icon for the data type and tell it I want to make that text. So now what it's doing is it's saying you've already got a step that changes the data type to number. Do you remember I just showed you a moment ago that in the change type applied step that we already have had, the zip code has changed to a whole number in 64. If I say replace current now, it will just replace that little piece of the code in step 3. If I say add new step, it's going to leave step 3 unchanged and add a new step as step 4, which changes the zip code type. I'd like to change step 3, so I'm going to say replace current. So now you can see a very small change here. It's now changed zip to type text. The units is a whole number, that's fine. Revenue, this is a bit more subtle. For revenue, that represents money, and in Power Query there's a special data type for use with currency marked with a $sign called fixed decimal number. So I want to change revenue to fixed decimal number, and again I want to change it in this current step rather than adding a new one. Okay, let's go to the international sales data. So first thing to do here, I think, is again to change the type. We're currently on a change type step where it's given a type to everything. So if we change the types to be correct and modify this one, we won't get into difficulties with it, for example, changing the zip code to a number, hitting a whole lot of errors when there are rows in the data that are not numbers, and then after that happened trying to change them back to text, because that's what would happen if we added a separate step to change the zip code to text. We want this first instance of the change type step to do the work for us. Okay, so I'm going to leave source name alone for now. Product ID 123, that's fine. Date is fine. So zip code needs to be text. Do you want to change the current step? Yes. Units, the same as before. Revenue should be fixed decimal number. Replace current. And the country needs to be staying the same as text. Okay, our data types are all fine now for international sales and compatible with the data types for the US sales and the sales query. And now we can do some more structural things. I don't really need this column, the source name, that tells me where which file each row came from, because that's also recorded in the country column on the right. So I can delete the source name column. I'm just going to right click and say remove. So these two tables, the international sales and the sales tables, are almost the same now. The only difference is that international sales has a country column and sales doesn't. All of the other columns are the same, have the same name and the same data types. So we should be able to append those two tables of data together, which we're actually going to do in the next video. Fine, okay, so onto the product query now. We're going to need to do a couple of things here before making sure that our data types are correct, which is a little bit awkward. The product column, that is the concatenation of two different fields, the product and the segment, separated by a delimiter, the pipe symbol. So we're going to need to apply the split tool here. So I can either do it using that split column button on the ribbon, or I can right click and say split column by delimiter. It hasn't recognized what the delimiter is automatically. When it's a more common delimiter like a hyphen or something like that, then it can do that automatically. So I've got to replace that hyphen with a pipe symbol. So I just typed it in. Pipe symbol on your keyboard is probably in the bottom left hand corner next to the left hand shift key. I'm going to leave everything else the same and say OK, and now that's split my field into two. So product.1 should just be the product, so let's just rename that. Double click on the header, and product.2, that's going to be the segment. And we'll come back to the price in a moment. The price column also needs to be split into two pieces, but I'm going to do that a different way just to show you a new technique. Before we do that though, the category. Do you remember that when we looked at the data source, we found that it had this rather awkward format in the Excel spreadsheet, with the category being specified once and then a whole lot of blanks under that until we got to the next instance of a different category being specified once and then a whole lot of blanks. So the intention in the spreadsheet was for all the blanks to mean the same category as the one that had been specified above. So blanks translate into nulls in Power Query, so I need all of the nulls below mix to be replaced by mix, and then the nulls below rural to be replaced by rural, and so on. And there's a special tool for that. If I right click on there and say fill, I've got fill down and fill up. Fill down will do what I want. Fill up would take the non-empty entries and then fill the nulls above them with those entries. So I want to fill down. When I do that, now my blank's all filled with the entry that was above. Good, almost done. So now with the price, I want to split that out into the currency symbol and the number that actually represents the price. Strictly speaking, the easiest way is probably to use split by delimiter using the space as the delimiter. But let me show you a new way of doing this that is quite clever. It's a really nice feature of Power Query that is very useful for doing awkward kinds of transformations where it's really difficult to work out by hand what the formula should be. So I'm going to create a new column. So I'll say add column, and then I'm going to use column from examples. And if I use the drop down underneath there, having selected the price column first, one of the options is from selection. So it's going to take the data that's in that existing price column and make a new column. And first of all, I think I will just take out the text bit on the left. So it's given me a blank column here, and the idea is you just type some of the values you want it to give you. So I'd like it to say USD. So I type USD there and press enter, and now you'll see that grayed out, it gives me entries that it thinks I might be looking for. So those also say USD. if I look at the M code, it tells me what the M code is that it's worked out I might want above. It says transform is text dot before delimiter, and price here in square brackets refers to the name of that price column, and the space is the delimiter. So yes, that is what I want it to do. I want it to give me the text before the space delimiter. Fine, okay, so I say okay. Now I can rename that currency, and then let's do it again to take out the number bit. So select price, column from examples from selection, and now I want to type 412.13. 412.13. Press enter. Now what's it giving me? So the third entry down, 963.38, that looks good. And if I check my formula, text dot after delimiter, so it's giving me everything after the space delimiter, which again is exactly what I wanted to do. So I say OK. And rather than trying to call this price as well, I will call it MSRP. MSRP. Manufacturer's retail price. And then now I've done that, I don't actually need the original price column anymore. So let's remove that. Right click, remove. Now you might be thinking, well, if you remove the price column, then how can it calculate the separate components of it, the currency and the MSRP parts? Well, we've removed that as a later step. So the currency and MSRP columns have already been created by the time we come to delete the original price column. So that should work fine. And now we can go back and make sure that the data types of everything are okay. I think the only one that we're going to need to change in this table is the MSRP, and that should be changed, of course, to fixed decimal number because that represents currency. Right then, let's go down to the geography query. So with geography, we've got a bit more fundamental stuff to do. Here we have two blank rows at the top, or two rows containing mostly blanks that we don't want. So we need to start then by deleting those two rows at the top. So I'm going to come back to my home tab and say remove rows, and then when we say remove top rows, it will ask us how many we want to delete. Just want to delete the top two rows. Now I'd like to take what it thinks is the first row of the data and to promote that to the column names. And there's a single button to do that. Use first row as headers. Good. Okay, so we've now got our data in the correct structure. All we need to do now is to check our data types again. So the zip code, yet again, is in the wrong format, or the wrong data type. So let's go into there and change that to text. And yes, replace the current. I don't want that to be a new step. And then just check that the other ones are correct. The other ones are all text. Those should be fine. Now the only thing that's a bit awkward about this is that we have a previous applied step that changed the column that was about to become the zip code into text. So I'm going to delete the earlier change type columns. Now it's saying this is not the last step, and so some of the later ones might not work if you delete this earlier step. Well, it's just a step that changes the data type, so I know that won't be a problem for later. So I say fine. Fine, so finally down to manufacturer. Now this is a bit more fundamental. Do you remember what we needed to do here? The very first thing we had to do to this table was to do a transpose of it, because I wanted manufacturer ID, manufacturer and logo to become column headers. So the first thing we're going to do is to go to the transform tab, and then just below the name of the tab there's a transpose button. Click on there, and now it switches the rows for columns and the columns for rows. And now here we want to promote the first row of data to headers. Use first row as headers. We're almost done. Now all we have to do is to get rid of the 3 columns on the right that contain this redundant data full of nulls. I could right click on each of these columns one at a time and say remove, but there's a neater way of doing it in one step. If I click here on choose columns, that shows me the names of all the columns I've got. Now I can just remove the ticks from the ones I don't want, say OK, and now they're gone. There's just one final thing I wanted to show you about Power Query before we finish the video off, which is the data preview tools. So on the View tab, we've got a couple of other things that are really useful. So the data preview allows you to look at the structure of your data, and it's particularly useful when you're trying to understand whether a particular field is unique or not. Just below the names of the headers, there's a coloured line. If I hover over that and very carefully point at where it is, it will give me 3 numbers. The number of entries that are valid, the number that are errors, and the number that are empty, and the percentages of those things. We can actually get it to display all 3 numbers for all of the columns that are visible by clicking on column quality. So under region, you can see that we've got a few empties here, and under city as well. I've got a few locations that don't have a city specified. If I go to column distribution, that draws a little frequency chart at the top of each column, giving me an idea of a count of the number of entries with a particular value. And it also displays 2 numbers, the number of values that are distinct and the number that are unique. We can also see in more detail what the distribution is like if we select a particular column and then click on column profile. And that draws me a detailed frequency chart for that particular column. So I can now hover over any of these values and it tells me how many entries there are with that value. So 39,360 entries with the value 475. If I go to the product table and take a look at the product ID, we can compare 3 numbers here. Let's do a column profile based on the entire data set for that one. And there are 2,412 entries in that column, and it also tells me that there are 2,412 entries that are distinct and 2,412 that are unique. So that is what we need to be able to use this column as a primary key in the table. So this is a unique identifier for the products. So it's useful to be able to check that those 3 numbers are the same. The number distinct, the number unique, and the total number in the column. Good, so that's the preview features. That's really useful for understanding the structure of your data. And then finally, one other little thing that foxes people sometimes when I'm teaching a course, somebody accidentally clicks this Close Query Settings pane button, and then I get this plaintive cry from them saying, help, help, my applied steps have disappeared completely. How do I get them back? What you do is on the View tab, you can turn that pane on again, open it up by clicking on Query Settings. Okay, so that opens and closes it there. Good, so we're ready now to do some basic database operations, starting with appending the sales and the international sales into one table. Okay, see you in the next video.